Welcome to American Architecture Now. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest this evening is Michael Graves. Michael Graves is among the most influential architectural educators in the nation. He has been a professor of architecture at Princeton University and the center of a group of students for 18 years now. Mr. Graves has helped define Princeton's identity as a strong, self-assured school that is deeply committed to aesthetics. His architectural work, which includes residences, medical facilities, cultural facilities, and town plans, has won 6 design awards from Progressive Architecture and 2 from the AIA. Yet he is as well known for his murals as for his buildings, and his architectural drawings have been widely praised. A warm welcome to you, Michael Graves.
Thank you.
It's apparent, at least to some of us, that you have rejected modern architecture as a social instrument. Your view, it seems, is that architecture communicates with individuals and not classes. That view holds that the architect is not only a technician who can solve functional problems, but also is an arbiter of taste. And it is in this role that he is called upon, in a way similar to the modern painter, to say something that is new and to propound a philosophy. I wonder if you would take a moment and describe your philosophy for us. To understand your work, what is it that we have to know?
That's a long question. It starts off with a premise that I think is not true, that maybe I would ask you to repeat, having something to do with interested in the individual in lieu of a class or the society. It went something like that. I would suspect that any architecture is only architecture when it does both. And it is curious to me that there are those that think that if one attends well to one, the other can't be true. But certainly in any architecture, the double reading of the composition has to be made by the society, the culture, the individual, with some degree of simultaneity. In that regard, I would say that one's work is a reflection of that caring, I suppose, for both the collective attitude and the individual attitude. That's just a kind of rebuttal to that first part. What was the other?
What should we know about your work to best understand it? On what philosophical base does it rest? Well, may I suggest, I will talk louder. For those of you who cannot hear, there are a number of seats that are very close to the front. I'm doing the best that I can. That's an other than usual response. And I am talking as... Sorry?
I'll repeat Barbara Lee's questions, okay?
Please do that. In fact, I have another idea. How would you like to ask the questions, too? I'm going to try again.
All right. Well, Barbara Lee asked about the problems of the architect as he is regarded as someone who is an arbiter of taste. Having just read Bob Gutman's review of my monograph, evidently that notion is in the air, but I don't think the architect really is the arbiter of taste. I think that in our current society, this kind of session that we're having now has more to do with levels of taste and understanding than any one person, that there are obviously people out there doing work which is probably more interesting than a lot of the people you will talk to. But the fact that you've talked to some people, or that others write about people that are become known because of one thing leading to the next, the level of understanding of those particular points of view, aesthetics, take on the world, becomes a part of the culture at large, it seems, because it becomes a part of the critical domain. It's discussed, it's it's understood, it's denied, it's accepted, whatever. So in terms of taste, which is a difficult one anyway, I suspect that there is a consciousness of taste that is held by the society, probably first, and as the architect fits into that and confronts that prevailing taste, there is a kind of give and take. The architect, the artist, the poet, the economist, whatever, as ideas become known, they are assimilated. They become a part of the culture in that critical debate, and in that sense, there is some shift that goes on constantly in the way we look at things, the way we see things. I'm avoiding taste, but if that's what you mean, I suspect that this kind of session, more than my next house or the publication of my next building, has more to do with taste than the building itself.
You talk about shift. In the past few years, surely your own work has drifted toward an architecture that is far less abstract and that pays much more attention to cultural symbolism. A few years ago, your work was generally white, rather austere, if complex, and associated through the joint publication of the book Five Architects with the work of architects such as Richard Meyer and Peter Eisenman. In the past few years, however, there seems to be much more of an emphasis to classical architecture, and your work seems now to be an unusual mix of classicism and cubism. Can you describe this movement and what provoked it and why it did take place?
Yes, that for me is a very interesting question, because in a shift of position, which is seen by some taking a building 10 years ago or 12 years ago and looking at a building now, it seems to the layman or to somebody seeing that first object and a late one as if they're sort of night and day. They're diametrically opposed. But the shift was very, very gradual. But nevertheless, there is an enormous difference. The difference comes about, I suppose, because of reaction, both my own reaction to my buildings as they were built, and the readers of one's architecture, the layman, the client, but most of all the critics, who play for me a very important role, because I felt for a time in reading reactions to buildings that I was designing in the 60s that I was not just losing readers. I felt that in fact they were not reading into my abstractions what I expected. And there is a difficulty there in any abstract code, and of course architecture in its geometrical frame uses the abstractions inherent in geometry, and is very likely to suggest in the development of a given composition, or the architect starts to suggest in that abstraction something that for all of us standing on the outside of that figure, that composition, something that might be very difficult to enter into in terms of a language. How is the language understood when the surfaces are neutral? How is the language understood when the textures, the chiaroscuro, the idea of the building has been neutralized to the point where it's, in a sense, non-figural? The problem with my architecture in the 60s, I think, though I was certainly aware of what I was doing and the kind of attitudes I had about it, which movement in a building. Nevertheless, people were finding them as gestures that were, for some readers, entirely too formal in their dimension. In other words, they didn't address the other symbols of the culture. That kind of problem, it seems to me, is overcome to some extent, if one is willing to play into the abstract language, which is necessary to any art form, any language, we have to be to some degree abstract to say more than one thing. We cannot have any purposeful ambiguity in our language unless there are some abstractions. But at the same time, we run the risk, if we are not figurative enough, to exclude the reader in the first place. We have to have some degree of balance between what is figurative, what is associational, what is understood as symbolic in terms of its figural association, and what is multifaceted in the sense that the abstraction allows the several readers of the composition to read into it what they want. And so over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a kind of gradual shift to attempt that equity between what is figural and what is abstract.
Were those early white buildings meant to be colored?
In fact, they were. And some of them are colored inside. Oh,
I have a very tiny voice. I will try to speak as loudly as I can. Well, speak to the electronics, please. I'm also fragile. Can one of you please see what's happening up there? Perhaps that would help.
You may not be plugged in.
That may be the case. Can one of you check this, please?
The question is...
I'll ask it again, if I may. And that is, I think perhaps you discovered, you found out what the difficulty is? Tell all.
It's your dinner plans.
The auditorium speaker system is out. They are trying to repair it now. Did you hear that? We're going to start again. The question was, were the early white buildings meant to be colored?
The early white buildings.
Which early white buildings? Let me ask you the question again. We were talking about the drift in your work, and I asked the question, were the early white buildings meant to be colored? And you said?
Well, the five architects were, by the press, named the Whites, primarily because we had done more neutral, abstract work based on some of the early work of Le Corbusier than work that developed out of natural materials. There was, however, a very strong emphasis of color in the work of John Haydick from his first buildings. There was as well in mine. In the first two buildings that I built, however, the clients felt that the color that had been proposed was in a sense too much for the context. They said, you're welcome to paint the inside of our buildings, leave the outside alone. But more importantly, at that time, there was what I would regard as a kind of Neoplatonic stand that we were taking about the idea of architecture being derived from general principles rather than specific ones, while the so-called Greys, group of architects, Venturi, Moore, Stern, etc., were seen as people who were deriving their compositions at the outset, in the conceptual stage at least, from a kind of particular point of view. I think since that time that most of those two schools have seen again an equity between those two positions, and we're not quite as feisty about being so overly general that the specific attitude of a local region can't play into the organization, nor do I think that they, on the other hand, would disallow kind of the general framework of their compositions to be more actively read.
You said that you felt your public and your critics were not reading your intent before this shift in your work. Did you doubt the validity of the earlier work, or did you want to move to what you felt was closer to the mood of your time?
Well, I thought that even though I was convinced that it should be buddy apparent that all those things that I was trying should be apparent to everybody else, I thought it was going to be a pretty lonely world out there for me if I continued to speak what seemed to be a more or less private language. And the privacy of my language was not what I was interested in. In fact, being by nature a generalist, I very much wanted to be inclusive of not the mood of the society, but the culture at large.
Is there such a thing as an architectural spirit of the time? Is that a simplistic notion?
I think it's pretty simple as an idea. There is no doubt, however, that we are influenced by the time. Mies van der Rohe is quoted as saying that architecture has to do with the will of the epoch. And I doubt that Picasso had to do with the will of the epoch. He changed the way we saw by virtue of including the way we saw in a new way of seeing, a new series of ideas in Cubism and other discoveries that he made in the way we see. And it seems to me that there is a requirement on the part of the artist, the architect, whomever, to understand the current condition of the society, to understand the historical context, and to take another look.
Well, both your architecture and your painting can stand on their own merits. They seem to inspire one another. Could you discuss for us the relationship your painting has to your architecture? Is it a hybrid? Is it, what is the interrelationship?
Well, for me, my painting is an extension of my architecture. And at least it started that way. The things I was not able to do in architecture because of meager budgets or because of particular projects that one was given, were in a way taken out in the painting. The ideas of the development of passage within very shallow space, the ideas of thresholding, of moving past the picture plane, whether it's the facade of a building or the facade of a canvas, was endemic to both. But I felt that in the painting, where in a way I was my own client, I was able to express a richer dimension of those ideas. Lately, however, the work in both painting and architecture has come together much more closely, as I suspect it would, and had wanted it to. Not so much because the budgets or the projects are more generous, but I suppose because I, on the other hand, am more frugal with the gestures in both architecture and in painting, and the two things are starting to meet each other in more or less a head-on kind of aesthetic that pleases me a lot.
To the work of what artist do you most respond?
Oh, that's very difficult. I'm an avid looker and reader of everybody's work. I read once that Robert Motherwell felt very guilty on Sunday afternoon when he looked at his picture books. I do the same thing. I look constantly. I look and I draw. I draw what I see, and if I were to look at a painting of Matisse, or look at a painting of Morandi, or look at a painting of Montaigne, I would probably end up taking archetypal conditions of the painting to my own memory by virtue of drawing them, trying to remember by drawing, and so I would find it difficult to say there's one kind of attitude or one kind of person that I would look to. There are attitudes in painting, however, painting and architecture, pardon me, that are extremely important to me, and they have to do not so much with classical ideas as painting and architecture that is willing to classify. One of the essential roles of painting and architecture, it seems to me, is to talk about differences, to ultimately bring the differences together in a single composition, but to suggest that there are classifications and hierarchies of elements and symbols within any given composition. And essentially those are the kind of paintings, and that's the kind of architecture I tend to look at most.
I was going to, I assumed that you were going to mention some of the Cubists.
I could mention the Cubists. I could mention the entire Renaissance. It's not an easy thing for me to say Gris, Picasso, to say Raphael, Montaigne, to say Greek low-relief sculpture, antique sculpture. I can say those things, and they are the things that attract me, but the edges of those worlds are such for me that they tend to blur and meet in between, so that I really like to look at most of everything.
The project that seems to, the most recent project that seems to bring together both your architectural and artistic concerns is the project for a bridge, the Fargo-Moorhead Cultural Center, that links the twin cities of Fargo, North Dakota and Moorhead, Minnesota, in a single structure that spans the Red River. That building, and I assume most people by now know about it, but I'd like to remind them that that building incorporates radio and television studios, a concert hall, historical museum, and an art museum on the span itself. I guess it's 3 buildings rather than 1. A number of people have said that it is a project, a building that shatters a lot of ideas about what a building should be like. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis and the evolution of that design? How did you get the commission? Will it be built, and when?
Okay. I got the commission by giving a lecture at the University of Virginia. I always knew it would pay off, all that talk. There happened to be a young man in the audience that heard the lecture, who was from North Dakota, who later was asked by the city of Fargo to put together a list of 100 architects. They asked this young architect, Royce Yater, if he would please introduce them by way of showing them publications, the work of 100 architects across the country. But that was only after they had asked him to summon the work of the 3 best architects that he knew. And he said, in what category do you mean, the 3 best architects? Which is an interesting question. And they said, well, there's a Frenchman, there's Frank Lloyd Wright, and there's a Scandinavian, we've forgotten his name. And I thought that was pretty good. And
1 out of 3.
He said that there was a problem with all 3 of those people. And then the next was that they said, well, the next 2 or 3 that we know are the people that have been on the cover of Time magazine. There you see, you strike again. And he said, who's that? And they said, Ed Stone and Minoru Yamasaki. And then he did a kind of soft shoe shuffle and said, well, maybe we ought to go to a larger list. And he suggested that he do some research and put together a very pluralistic list. He evidently got the list from a publication by Charles Jenks, who's known to make lots of lists. So I asked Royce at one point how he was able to develop this list of 100 architects. He said he took 1 from each camp. I figured at that point we were all in trouble. But anyway, from that list, they showed the work to the clients called the task force. They selected from that a group of 20. They sent letters to the 20. And from the responses to the letter of how we would go about making a composition for this particular place and this particular use, they selected 4 architects. They interviewed the 4 The four were Charles Moore, Hugh Hardy, Hardy Holtzman and Pfeiffer, and Stanley Tigerman and myself. We won. The project has been going on now for over 2 years. It's a public project. It is one that is surrounded by controversy out there. Mayors have come and gone. Various funding agencies have been very generous to us and to the task force. And at this point, after doing the kind of master plan for all three buildings, the History Museum on the Moorhead, Minnesota side has asked us to do the design development drawings, which we've just last week completed, and presumably the working drawings will be done in the next 8-10 months for that. So at least that third of it is going ahead in the next year.
You mentioned earlier why you had turned to painting. In this instance, you've been able to transform these masterful painterly collages into three-dimensional buildings. How close will the buildings be, will the actual buildings be to the drawings?
I think drawings are drawings and buildings are buildings. I think that I would make a suggestion that for me, when I draw and I draw ideas about the buildings. I certainly try to represent the ideas first. The drawings, however, are watercolor or Prismacolor or graphite on paper, and therefore they cannot be a building. They can be a representation of a building, but they don't intend to imitate reality. The same way, again, John Haydock once said when asked a question like this, I don't expect my buildings to imitate, my drawings to imitate my buildings any more than the reverse. That perhaps is going a step too far, but nevertheless, I think that if one can represent ideas of mass, ideas of the polychromatic value of the light and dark, the chiaroscuro, the sense of space within a drawing, and do the same in a building, and they are similar to each other, that's as much as I need. But I think there is a tradition in this country, and there is a tradition in architecture in general, where we see drawings as not just as renderings, but as tools to buildings. And there are drawings that we make that are tools to buildings. Those are our working drawings, and they are specifications. They are detailed analytical drawings that show us exactly how to build the object. But they don't try to represent ideas the same way that a drawing might try to represent a building. I'm sure that's not the answer you expected, but it's mine.
That's what I expected. Can you describe briefly your intent in that project?
Yeah, we had originally wanted to defuse the competition between the two towns, Fargo and Moorhead, two towns that are separated by the Red River of the North.
It's not a very wide river, is it?
No, it's not a very wide river. It's true. It does flood in the spring, and it becomes a very wide river then. But the rest of the time is a very pleasant canal-like in its dimension, a canal-like body of water. About half the Tiber, I think. The Red River, however, has traditionally been the boundary that has called up the competition and the separations of those two states and their separate identities. But because of the size of those two towns, it was really inappropriate to build two cultural centers. Enough's enough. So they did decide that if they could come together around these facilities, that perhaps there was an architectural composition that would reduce the sense of which belonged to which side. So I was quite conscious of that problem within the two states, the two cities, and those two identities. We had first wanted to, as I say, diffuse that competition by changing the shape of the line, the river itself, and in a sense damming it up so that we could make a water garden, make a centroid, make a place like a small lake that would allow the buildings to surround that center, and so that the cultural center would be, in fact, the pleasure garden, the water body for pleasure craft in the center of the river. That, as a formal strategy, simply wasn't possible because of structural problems of the soil in that region. So what we've done instead is to make a building that focuses on the river, both the north and the south, as it spans east to west, that has the art museum, which is a kind of linear gallery, a link between the History Museum on the Minnesota side and the concert hall on the Fargo side, because of the history of those two communities and their regard for those two parts of the program and what was behind all of that. They seemed most natural, but the art museum was the thing that was shared by both, as both communities have art museums. We brought them together in a single span over the river. Well, that technically, of course, that's not difficult. The idea of a kind of Ponte Vecchio or a bridge building is though the Ponte Vecchio is one of the few built ones, we know from Palladio and others the number of experiments that went on in determining buildings over bridges for similar reasons that I used. But it was possible to focus an enormous opening, this time an enormous window to the north for the permanent collection of the museum, while on the southern side there is another similar window which opens to the southern light for a public porch at an upper level of the bridge that looks down on the river, one, and two, to the concert hall and its adjacent amphitheater, so that people can take their lunch and noontime concerts and that sort of thing, which now occur on the bridge. They close the street and have concerts on the bridge, so it's already that kind of symbol. They have chamber groups at lunch. The trucks don't like it, but the bridge would get over that problem. But nevertheless, that kind of association with the shoreline or the bank and the river and then the porch itself were a way to make a kind of volume out of all of those things that brought us there in the first place. So it seemed to me that the symbol of linkage was probably as important, if not more important, than the individual pieces themselves.
In addition to the cultural center, you have designed museum spaces in New Jersey as well. Perhaps you would take a moment and tell us about what you feel the architect's role is in the making of display spaces.
Well, I've been terribly influenced by other museums. The way objects are shown, for me, to best advantage, have to do with putting objects in rooms, not spaces, have to do with making an ambiance around the object to be shown that is that encourages or sponsors attitudes about that object. Not that one is making period rooms, but one can make a room or give an identity to a place that would heighten or, in a sense, turn the rheostat up on the value of the artifact to be shown or the range of artifacts to be shown, rather than the neutrality that some of modern architecture seems to regard as essential to the display of certain artifacts. By contrast, the modern architect says, if my walls and my rooms are neutral, in a way, the objects can be shown to best advantage. I would, I guess, take the opposite point of view and say that there could be a kind of debate between the room and the artifact, so that both, in a sense, become more.
And have you employed that theory in the design of display spaces? Have you had that option?
Very, very little, actually. At that point in any project, the budget is usually dwindling, and one can only suggest. I have, in the Moorhead, Minnesota History Museum, however, described a series of rooms that take a kind of, this is a programmatic requirement, but take a kind of linear path through the chronology of the culture of that landscape, it's an agrarian-based society there, and have described a series of rooms that I think will encourage that chronology. That isn't the case in the Union County Museum, which is one of my first buildings, and the work that I've done for the Newark Museum has been around education rather than around display space.
Do you always create works of art for your own buildings?
How do you mean that?
Murals, interior works of art.
They're usually offered. Sometimes they're accepted and sometimes not.
Well, let us talk about the converse of that, and that is, what is your feeling about the use of works by other artists within the spaces you have designed? How do you react to that?
Well, occasionally we've been asked to do interiors, though not frequently, but occasionally we've been asked to do interiors where people do have collections. And whether it's a modern collection or whether it's an antique collection, one would, I suspect, try to use the same principle. And I have, in the few times that that's been open to me, attempted to do that.
Well, how do you feel about doing a building for a collection of works of art about which you might not be particularly fond?
Such as?
Well, I don't know the range of your taste.
Well, it's pretty inclusive.
So there would be nothing that would be excluded
I'm trying
from
to
that
think.
wide
I mean,
net.
it's a reasonable question. There are certain things probably that would interest me more than other things. For instance, if one were making a museum of pop art as against a museum of artifacts bound up more broadly based in the culture, like the Moorhead Museum, I would probably prefer the latter, because the other, to me, is somewhat singular and is a kind of art parlante. It's a word architecture that isn't, for me, inclusive of enough to, in a sense, develop the kind of ambiance that would I think, be necessary. But if I could draw that kind of comparison, that might be fair.
We've talked about collaboration here between artists and architects, and indeed we have talked about that as well. And for a moment, I wonder if you would address yourself to the state of collaboration as you see it between artists and architects. Is it possible and is it feasible?
I think both those are true, and not simply because I like to paint. I don't regard myself as a painter, but I do like to do it. The thing that's happening as my work is more widely published and more people see it, I have gotten responses from a number of artists who have asked to collaborate on various projects. And I am absolutely bowled over by the incredible interest that we share, that between what they're doing, some people, what they're doing, and others that I tend to know from other publications. I have to admit, not overwhelmed by much of what I see in the art world, but it's interesting as my work is published, the kinds of people that come out of the woodwork and send me slides of their work. I think that in time, collaborations will be possible.
Have you ever collaborated with an artist other than yourself?
I haven't, no.
Would you like to?
I think we probably will do it soon. We're doing a project in the Northwest where, by federal grant, there's a specification for 1% of the budget.
I think that's a gentleman's agreement rather than a grant.
Is it?
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the GSA percent of construction costs given to art. That is literally not a gentleman's agreement.
Well, our clients agreed, and...
No, it's the gentleman's agreement on the part of the GSA.
Yes.
Perhaps you'd like to discuss that project because it is your most recent one, and I think it was awarded just within the last several days. Yeah. And I assume when you talk about the Northwest, you're talking about Portland, Oregon. and why it is so important. It's also the largest commission that you have ever received. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it tonight because the City Council is receiving the determination of the jury today and debating it today. They're 3 hours behind us, so I'll be on the phone as soon as we leave here, but to find out what happened. But I'll get into that in a moment. This was a shortlisted competition for what might be regarded as a City Hall annex. It's called the Public Service Building of Portland, Oregon. It's a $22 million building, which essentially takes the bureaucratic services and various bureaus of the city government from the kind of scattered network that they now have in Portland and place them in a single building adjacent to the present City Hall, which is a fine turn-of-the-century Renaissance, American Renaissance building that reminds me more of Ledoux than it does of the Renaissance, but that's what I'm told. It's Renaissance. But the Portland building was a competition held between Mitchell Jurgula, Arthur Erickson, and myself, and the jury recommended our scheme. The local architects, however, in Portland are, how shall I say, furious.
Can you describe the scheme and their reaction to it?
Yeah. First of all, the competition was, as I understand, organized originally or thought up originally by Neil Goldschmidt, who is now Secretary of Transportation. Neil Goldschmidt was then mayor of Portland. He's a young, active mayor, and he looked around him and knew, as he travels a lot, and knew that even though Portland's major office structures are really fine in terms of modern architecture, I sense that they're amongst our best. He felt that there was something else going on in architecture, and Portland wasn't getting it. And he was worried that two major firms there would continue to get the major commissions, and in a sense, more steel and reflective glass would be built in Portland. Though well done, he was worried that it was becoming a kind of singular aesthetic in that town. I think that's pretty perceptive. So he organized, before he left Portland, just in time, the competition, and selected a number of citizens to participate on the jury. He then asked the jury to select an advisor who would be, these were all laymen, an advisor who was an architect, and they picked Johnson and Berge, and they became the advisors to the jury. We designed a building that I presume is somewhat threatening to maybe that word is too strong, but it's the way I feel, I suppose, that is threatening to either the status quo or the level of abstraction, modernity, machine aesthetic, however one might see those towers in Portland, to the extent that the FAIA and grand old men of Portland have joined together to write the City Council and speak against our building and Philip Johnson's judgment in the City Council. So it's gotten to be a kind of political problem at this point. And today's vote is extremely important for us. Though we won the competition, it's likely to be the jury recommendation may be thrown out by the City Council. I'm not sure. I say that my building is perhaps threatening because it, as I said earlier, attempts to make classifications. It attempts to suggest that the building has a base, and in the city the base is anthropomorphically understood as a kind of leg of the building, and it's very different than the shaft or body of the building, which in turn is different than the head or cornice or capital of the building. And those distinctions, anthropomorphically described in a kind of mimetic aesthetic, one that in a way speaks back to us, communicates one way or another with us, is something that gives the building an identity. It's been called by the local press, my building has been labeled already, it's been labeled the temple, and the temple design and the people's temple, and that kind of idea is at first I guess one would hesitate to want that to occur, but in reflection, I guess that's really what one is after, is that the building starts to stand for something. The building starts to be something, and it is no longer primarily engaged in a kind of metaphorical similarity between itself and the machine, the kind of modern idiom of using the machine. And the head of the building, the top of the building, also reflects that programmatic problem that we had to deal with, which was that a good third of the building was to be rented out as market rental space, and so that there is a break in the building, and at the 10th floor, this is a 15-floor building, and at the 10th floor there is a kind of head to the building that is supported by the city services below, and there is some literal symbolism used in the building in terms of the idea of support, and even the idea of the core, the structure of the building is represented as a kind of anthropomorphic language. We have used our 1% art to re-describe, if you will. Evidently, one of the few places we've been successful is to re-evaluate or re-see the city symbol, which is a female symbol holding a trident in one hand and a wreath of wheat in the other, thereby just saying something about port and land. So we've seen her again, and she's been hoisted above our entrance and identifies the primacy of entrance and threshold in our building. And it's not a neutral code. It's something that has a very strong language about it, and I suppose it speaks a little too loudly. The rheostat is turned up a little too high at this time, I suppose. But we have also evidently upset the local architects by using art again in some rather expansive garlands that are brought along the side of the building that give a kind of traditional welcome into this new garden. That's how garlands traditionally are used. You can see them on 12th Street in the classical buildings. But this too is an unorthodox kind of position, and it's seen as frivolous and upsetting the clean, hygienic aesthetic that has been made the kind of workaday idea that has gone on there and most other places for so long. An aesthetic that I find so incredibly alienating that I suppose if I were bound to do that the rest of my life, I'd rather practice law.
Well, it should come as little surprise to that community, because your architecture has always dramatized everyday experience. And certainly there are certain architectural elements, particularly doors and points of entry, that you have always emphasized. In fact, entering a building, it seems to me, has always been a ceremonial event in each of your buildings, and with that passage and through that passage, a drama ensues. I've always wondered what you were trying to create with that drama, in spite of the fact that I've been engaged by it, but I wondered if it was the purpose of the raised doorway, or is it some dramatic visual connection between the sky and the building? What is the intent of that ceremonial point of entry?
Well, it can be all the things that you say, but it comes about in my work primarily because of I suppose from the wrong point of view. It's a kind of reaction that one has, a negative reaction to, again, the rather simplified code of the modern threshold. Modern architecture sees space as primary. My architecture would see the room as primary. And I say that, and I make a difference between those two, because if you look at certain drawings and certain buildings by people like Mies van der Rohe or Theo van Doesburg or the De Stijl artists, one sees an influence in our way of looking at the world that would see a kind of homogeneous world, that space is everywhere. Of course it is, but our society, our culture tends to make designations, tends to make separations from here to there, outside and inside. Now, in a way, we have the technical capacity to dissolve those differences. But when we dissolve those differences, we eliminate the designation of private and public, of sacred and profane. We dissolve and diffuse the ideas that have given the myths and rituals of our society identity. If we say that in the passage through a building that there are a series of thresholds, that there are a series of doorways, if you like, or even conditions of aesthetic framing as we pass from place to place, we label, understand, identify, and otherwise come into contact with those particular places. Now, there is also, if you include the idea of making a room, the idea of designation, of difference here to there, you could also, if your palette is as wide as that, which is to say very little, you could also include a more liberal or continuous network, a kind of hypostyle hall, a fluid distill-like arrangement. But what I, in my work, try not to do is to suggest that one is better than the other. But I would say that if one is without the other, then the language is impoverished. And so that if one is making designations, one is making the wall, and that is very frightening to us in a sense. But if the architect does not make walls, if the architect, in quotes, if the architect doesn't make designations, sacred, profane, inside from outside, then in a way the society has no use for those designations at all. But just as we speak to each other face to face, there is a surface between us. The language is our way of making the window between the two of us, of connecting our differences or the debate or making the conversation understandable. And that both mimetic and verbal interchange that is occurring is a surface of understanding that the society must have if it's to have those differences understood. Without those differences, public is private, private is semi-private, and there are no ways that we can get around that problem of that homogeneous, omnipresent spatial continuity. And so amplifying, perhaps too much in my own work, but amplifying that passage, that door, that window, the simple elements that the architectural language is made of, floors, ceilings, etc., and not, in a sense, running them into each other, is something that I care for in my work, to the extent that I'm also criticized because at some times one goes too far.
You've used in your writings the word, as you did this evening, the words sacred and profane to describe spaces very frequently. Were you inferring that architecture is a kind of secular religion?
No. I don't mean it. I mean it in the Eliadian sense, in that there are only designations. There are differences. There are, if one sees the landscape beyond as unknown and new and threatening, it is to us. It has always been to us primitive in our regard for it. If we make or idealize a place, we, in a sense, sanctify it, but we sanctify it in the sense that we give it our own identity. We regard our presence in it as central to it, and therefore one makes that designation from the primitive to the ideal, though that's not a duality often used. It's one that will answer that kind of question.
Well, it's quite clear that you're particularly concerned with architecture as a language of elements as well, doors and windows and moldings and so on. They seem to perform a function, but also carry with them the symbolic meaning that the culture has imbued them with. In your work, many of your projects, until this point, have been additions. And many of those buildings themselves represent a composite of fragments. The point that I am trying to make or the question really that I'm asking, is in those instances of additions, are the old houses, the original structure themselves, are they considered a fragment?
Well, if one is truly dealing with a context, then of course what is there originally, the landscape that object is on, whether it's a house or another kind of building, and the new addition, whether it's an adjacent building or a building across the street or, as you say, an addition, it's all a part of an historical continuum that one must regard what we do not as the last thing that will be done, obviously, and so it too is a fragmentary condition. It becomes a part of the context. And once the two things are built together, old and new are still felt within any composition, because that's part of probably the thematic domain that we see certain things as representing newness, as other things are representing not antiquity but values held before this new object is made, which in turn may incorporate former values. But it seems to me that all of this stuff that we deal with as architects is essentially a continual and fragmentary kind of idea that can be suggested.
Well, in the evolution of your own work, you have surely incorporated historical quotation. You've mixed elements of the 1930s, streamlined design with Beaux-Arts classicism, and futurism with constructivism, and what comes out and what emerges, I guess, is an unexpected combination of the past, the present, and the future. Perhaps you could discuss a little more elaborately the notion of fragments and your underlying structure. Is there some general formula, or is each project completely new and individual, presenting its own problems and its own solutions?
No, the last suggestion is that every problem has its own solution is something that one understands, though I didn't know him personally, one understands was the basis of the work of an architect like Eero Saarinen. My work is just the opposite, in the sense that every problem is the same problem, and at the same time every problem is a different problem, but there are generalities and particularities that hold from one project to the next. That's not to say that one project will look like the next, but one's attitudes don't change that dramatically from one scheme to the next. There are obviously certain programmatic requirements, exaggerated programmatic requirements, certain functional requirements that we do fulfill, that do require specific knowledge that might not be held by us generally. But that's not the norm. We find ourselves generally working within a very normal societal framework. I tend to see my work, I tend to see architecture, as I said, in its classifications. The classifications for me are primarily thematic. They hold for us symbolic and representational interests that can be described in the way we would elaborate a sentence, the way we would elaborate an idea, as having certain themes, minor and major, hierarchical themes, themes that are to us part of the ritual of passage, if you will, if that's not too pompous, from place to place, from door to door, from surface to surface, from plan to plan, in the scoring of our work. But the various aesthetics that you suggested were embodied in my work are indeed there, and they are there not so much as an effort to collage those various aesthetics into one inclusive composition, but that it seems to me that certain ideas in each of those that you mentioned are regarded as having dominance in one area or one theme as against another, and so that employing them, those ideas that we know, or at least a suggestion of them, a kind of take on certain attitudes that we regard as public in the public domain, or the way we see them as a culture, are employed so that I can liberally describe the thematic intent of any work.
Well, perhaps the most single most important aspect of your work lies in its attitude toward nature. Your works are very clearly identifiable for their subtle and elegant colors. You assign meaning to colors that relate to nature, sky, earth, and foliage. Use earthy colors like dark green and terracotta at the base and sky blue tones above. Could you discuss with us, please, your present attitude toward color and why representational colors are important to you?
Well, in a way, you just have, in that I don't attribute to the polychrome of a building, the coloration of a building, an overwhelming density that formal constructs can have. But that's not to say that the color is additive. But in the labyrinth of color, there is a density that is, I suppose, beyond the individual surface of a given plane or volume. My color sense is very childlike in that the kind of description that you made can be, in a sense, believed easily. It doesn't try to upset the code. It doesn't do that because it needs, if I'm to represent the ground plane, let's say, not only on the ground, but somewhere else in the building as a new ground plane is made, very much the way this stage is a raised, an elevated ground, different from the ground of the rest of this room. There are two ground planes in here, and one can imagine in a more elaborate composition how that ground and the lower ground can be thought of, and so that there is not a single sort of dense terracotta, but there may be a representation of a new horizontal plane, and that elaboration of that neutral plane might be seen by coloring it, by its texture, and of course, most importantly, by its position. But without those designations, if all of our planes are white, or all of our planes are one color, whatever color, gray or terracotta or what have you, then it is a singular language, and it has to be a debate then only about the position of that place, that form, and the form itself within the whole composition. You might leave out texture, you might leave out color. So if you understand your aesthetic as inclusive, then one is going to question oneself about making the composition around its color code as well as about its formal code. And as those two things identify and amplify each other, it seems to me that the story is simply richer.
It's been said that you are lovingly and painstakingly inventing a different language of form and meaning, and that you left the postmodernists behind. I wonder if you would tell us if that was accurate, and how would you describe this new vocabulary that Ada Louise Huxtable and others say that you are in the process of inventing?
I don't think vocabularies are invented, and I don't wake up in the morning trying to do so. I was surprised to read that.
But were you pleased?
No, I'm not pleased to read that. I'd just as soon be regarded as other than a postmodernist, and that's quite okay. But in terms of inventing a new language, first of all, I don't think art is invented. But in any event, if there are discoveries, fine. We all discover things. But it is if one is disregarding one language and assembling a new one. And I would sense that any language is only worth its salt as the language is essentially accepted, and its meanings are accepted. And then we, in turn, examine those meanings by speaking the language otherwise, but speaking the language, the accepted language. And so the changes are only the kind of changes that one would experience from prose to poetry. They are seeing the words or seeing the form in a slightly changed manner, that one is inverting the language, one is subverting the language, one is using the language, but you must have the language to speak at all. So that if you can say that my base is terracotta, or that the soffit is azure blue, then you are, as I am, trying to speak the language. But if I at the same time make an inversion, I want you to be aware of the inversion, that the language has been and described differently, but it is our language, and without that language, as architects, we're finished.
Do you expect the viewer to respond that way? That list maker that you referred to before, Charles Jenks, once referred to one of, I guess, at least my favorites among your projects, the Snyderman House, is it in Fort Wayne? That was done about 1972. I think he called it a cross between a Gris and a Mondrian, a stucco box waiting to get out of a cage. Do you expect the viewer to interpret things in that kind of fashion?
Well, I always expect Charles to label things, and again, though some of his labels are not my labels, I think it's important to attribute attitudes to and understandings to what we see. I don't think, on the other hand, they should be simple attitudes, unless the thing intends to be simple.
How would you describe the Snyderman House?
Well, about the way he did. But I was in 1968 when that was first designed and finally finished in about 72. There's a problem inherent in those 4 years, obviously. I was pretty frantic, and the building, as seen, is overzealous. But it was one of the first times out, and I did as best I could. It is a kind of Neoplatonic frame, if that's what Charles means by the Mondrian, and within that Neoplatonic frame, which is plodding and simple-minded and continuous through the whole organization. It's based on the Maison Domino of Le Corbusier. Within that, there is a freer play of the surrounding and enclosing surfaces, the walls and the plan that is engaged by those walls, that is not so much trying to get out of that cage or that grid, but is in a kind of debate with it, so that one could see the neutrality of the structure against the particularity of what I was then attributing to the various sides and conditions of the local context, the entry against the view, the west light against the north light. And as I turned the rheostat up on those surfaces, they moved relative to the neutrality of that frame. I thought with the kind of standard language, I could then see the poetic language against it, and the contrast of the two would be worthwhile. It's one of those buildings that had very few readers.
There are certain recurring themes and forms in your work. I'm thinking of in the Fargo Moorhead Cultural Center, the Keystone, in the Plotchik House, which is sometimes referred to as the Keystone House, and the drawings that you often make. What is the significance of either that inverted or missing keystone?
Well, in the Fargo project, the keystone was my attempt to use an architectural element that is, in a sense, the public domain, where we have certain elements are germane to what we do. The window is one of them. The door is one of them. Of course, if the poet uses the door or the window, he's using it in a way that allows us to think about passage. If the poet uses the idea of the keystone as a symbol, he's obviously talking about that element, that piece of masonry that's been shaped in a particular way to hold things together. And it's a kind of literal symbol, but it is a way of using an architectural element symbolically. The keystone, because of the structural principles engaged in that building, is not pragmatically necessary. And therefore, if one eliminates the pragmatic necessity in any form, you tend to heighten the symbolic interest of that form. There is a kind of equity between those two in any object that we understand. And it seems to me that once I had voided the keystone, made, in a sense, a window out of it. And here's the Huxtable quote about the invention of a new language. I sense that this is why she says that if I superimpose a window on a keystone, now one doesn't do that in an orthodox sense. But if both are recognizable, both the window is recognizable from its mullions, and the keystone is recognizable through its form, that superimposed, made transparent, it seemed to me that I could heighten the value of the identity of that center portal of the bridge. And as we stand behind that opening, that window, that frame, and look out at the river, and in a way the landscape looks back at us, there is a movement that one might expect through that veil of an architectural symbol that is endemic to the way we think and label and understand our artifacts. And therefore, using it there was a way of heightening the bringing together of those two communities.
Which of your unbuilt buildings bring you the most pleasure?
Oh my. The next one.
I hope the next one will be a built one. Which of your built buildings bring you the most pleasure?
I really don't have favorites. It would be simple to say the one I'm working on or the one that's under construction, because one is constantly engaged in the kinds of things that we're doing right now, and the others seem to be less interesting to us. But in my case, I guess that's not true. And I don't mean to be saccharine about this, but there is a kind of lesson of each. And again, it sounds saccharine, but they are all one's children, and I regard them as very important to me. And the interest in them, the interest that I had in them, and the way I see them now, as I re-see them, is a part of one's education, and therefore I just couldn't do that. I mean, at least that hasn't happened, where I've made something that I say, this is demonstrably better than that. I would say, however, that this is demonstrably otherwise than that they are different things, that I discover things in one and against another. Even though there are continuities, there are other discoveries.
In your re-seeing them, other than your self-effacing response to the Snyderman house, are there any aspects that you would build differently now?
Yeah, I think that in the Snyderman house, in the Hanselman house, in the Benacerov house, that the language that I used was overly abstract. It was, I think, by Jack Robertson seen as a kind of hay thrasher in the garden in the Benacerov house. Perhaps strong language in his criticism of that building, but the building was a bit tumultuous. It was a bit strongly stated. It was important for me to make that building, and I, at the time, didn't see it that way. But if I were to see it, if I were to put it adjacent to buildings I'm designing now, I seem to be slightly more frugal about similar kinds of intentions, and the clarities, I think, are more apparent than they were then. However, in the Benacerov house, for instance, which Jack and others saw as overly abstract and based in an aesthetic discovered or made by Le Corbusier, I still have enormous interest in certain passages in buildings like the Benacerov house, and still lecture about them, because some of those things have not been played again, simply because the place hasn't been right, or the situation hasn't been right. But no place else have I been able to construct a kind of garden metaphor as literally and as abstractly with that kind of equity that I did in the facade of the Benacerov house. Though other parts of it perhaps aren't as one would have them today, that particular part of it is still instructive to me.
Is there anything that you especially like to design?
You mean, what would if I had my druthers, what I would rather design? No, jobs are so hard to get, you know.
It's true. For what would you?
You really don't look a gift horse in the mouth.
For what would you like best to be remembered?
The whole thing.
How lasting do you think the architecture of the 70s will be?
I have a very hard time with these kinds of questions. They seem so temporal, and I just don't think that way. I think things that I've at least discovered in my own criticism of work of the 70s or the 60s or the 50s when I was being trained, as well as my own work, which I'm also a critic of, become important to me in regard for the next thing that I do. It's not that that's the full bias, because, as I've said earlier, and as your question suggested, that one is interested in a larger frame of time. I would say, however, because I didn't earlier, that you said that some of the images that I employ regard the past and the present and the future. I doubt that any of us use the future. I can't tell what the future will bring. I'm, in a way, not interested in the future. I don't believe in progress in art, and therefore tomorrow is the future, but tomorrow is also simply very much like today. So for me, I don't try to think or second guess what it might be like next year or 5 years from now. That kind of idea just doesn't have much for me, and I tend to think of my work not so much as based in the past either. I do think of my work as using archetypal conditions of the past and the present. By archetypal, or the archetype, I would try, as I think is behind the Alois Huxtable comment that I have skirted, or have attempted, she thought, attempted to skirt the problems of postmodernism, in that one probably goes back a step further and is not using a stylistic reference, using style in this sense in the negative, though it is not a negative idea, and try to regard those simple elements that I talked about before as the primary understanding of the architectural construct, rather than a stylistic proposition after the archetype has been made.
It's obvious that Michael Graves' work demands thought. Excuse me. It also demonstrates that buildings can do more than fulfill a special function, that they can enrich our lives. And thank you for doing so this evening, Michael Graves, and thank you for being with us here.